All right, there we go. So we're looking at David's leadership today, which is in First Chronicles 12. And you can see there's a picture that I found on the internet there of men of that time, and that would have been how they would have dressed. You can see that they have spears and bows and arrows, and so this chapter talks much about that kind of thing. And certainly my father would appreciate the whole archery aspect of stuff, but these men would have been skilled, as we'll see later, to be able to sling stones either with the right hand or the left hand, and be able to shoot their bows and arrows with either hand as well. So they were what they would call ambidextrous, which means you can do two things, or do the same thing with either hand. I would say most of us are either one-handed or the other. I would be right-handed, and there's other people that are left-handed. But there are people out there that can very easily do the same kinds of tasks with both hands. My mother, when she was alive, she could write with both hands. Now, she was left-handed, but she could write with her right hand. It was not quite as good, but it certainly was very legible. So I just remember being kind of fascinated by that. So anyway, we're looking at First Chronicles 12 now. I'm just going to have a smattering of verses here and there because I don't want to read through the chapter. The chapter itself is 40 verses long, and it's a lot of names and a lot of numbers and all sorts of stuff like that. But basically, it is about David's army and the kinds of men that were there. And so that's what I want to highlight is the characteristics of David's men. So because I think what Chronicles is doing here, at least with David, is really not setting David up as a lone wolf of some kind or some sort of individual person, but he's setting him up as a man that is surrounded by good men. And so I want to look at those characteristics today of those particular men. I'll look at some names and meanings of names. So there's a whole pile of names, but we won't do that as we did sort of with the mighty men in the last chapter. But we'll just look at some of these phrases here. So. But the first one I want to look at is the fact that they were skilled men. In First Chronicles chapter 12, verse 2, it says that they were armed with bows, using both the right hand and the left, and hurling stones and shooting arrows with the bow. So here we have men that are described as ambidextrous men. So these are men that are skilled. And so as we go through these characteristics of David's men, we're looking at these men as leaders. David was a man who led leaders. He wasn't just a man who led followers. Because David knew that he was a mortal man and that he didn't know all things, couldn't do all things. So it was essential that he surrounded himself with skilled men that he could delegate authority to then carry out certain work. So a lot of the people that are actually mentioned in this chapter are people that are chiefs or captains or something like this. These are all men of leadership, and so David knew how important it was to pass on and develop leadership in his context, and that's a very, very needed thing in our society today, and especially in church. And this is why we need to pray for the men and women in church that are leaders, that they would not be drawing attention to themselves, but that they would be drawing attention first and foremost to the Lord Jesus Christ, and then be using those skills to enhance and develop other people. So, but the first thing that's sort of talked about here in this chapter is the fact that David's men were skilled men, and they came from a variety of tribes. In fact, when you look through the chapter, there's a representation from every tribe of Israel. And then there was the fact that they were fearless and fast. 1 Chronicles 12, verse 8, it says, some Gadites joined David at the stronghold in the wilderness, mighty men of valor, men trained for battle, who could handle shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions and were as swift as gazelles on the mountains. So, this is sort of interesting language, and to me, it's the kind of thing where you stop and look at this and say, well, what's that about? What is it like to have a face of a lion, and what does it mean to be as swift as a gazelle? And so when you think about the faces of a lion, you think about, here's the king of the jungle kind of thing, and there is nothing that causes fear for particularly a male lion. He has that big mane, and he's a fierce looking thing. So what that says to me is that these men, these leaders among David's men, are fearless men. And they now they didn't just get that from nowhere. They got that from how they were brought up. And they probably also got it too by seeing David from afar and saying, now there's a man whose face is like a lion. I want to join that and be part of that, and Elaine and I were talking this morning about, if we're like a coal in a fire and the coal is taken out and stuck on the hearth, the coal tends to die out and goes cold. But yet, if the coal remains within the fire amongst the other coals, it stays hot. And so these men were coming from all over the place, and coming from places where, if they stayed out there, they would have gone cold like a coal that was brought out of the fire. But they wanted to be amongst other people that had similar sort of aspirations. So now the Gadites were from the other side of the Jordan. If you can think in your mind's eye, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they crossed over the Red Sea and then sort of came up from the south and sort of swept around then and came in on the east side of the Dead Sea and crossed the Jordan River at that particular point, then going into the land of Canaan. So they kind of swept in from the south and then moved then toward the west. So, but there was 3 tribes, or at least 2.5 tribes, I guess. There was half the tribe of Manasseh, there was the Reubenites, and also the Gadites that then remained on the east side of the Jordan. And then the rest of the crowd went over on the west side of the Jordan and got their respective allotments of land and so on. But it says here that the Gadites then came over the Jordan, and they joined David, and that's a common word that's used in this chapter, where these people came and joined David, and and how important it is for us then to be joined with other people. Joined with people that have the aspiration of following God, because that's what David was known for. And they were as swift as gazelles on the mountains, and so they were agile people. They were quick off the mark. They weren't afraid to sort of bounce around, and keep themselves limber, as it were. And they didn't stall. They didn't sort of shuffle their feet and stand around and contemplate things for great periods of time. I think when things are on the move, we got to get moving, and we got to, be at things. Um, so, and not get stuck, behind the other people that are stuck and standing around. So we have skilled men and fearless and fast men. And then we have what I would say would be spiritual and committed men. So it says here in verse 17 and 18, it says, David went out to meet them and answered and said to them, if you have come peaceably to me to help me, my heart will be united with you. But if you betray me to my enemies, since there is no wrong in my hands, may the God of our fathers look and bring judgment. Then the Spirit came upon Amasa, chief of the captains, and said, we are yours, O David. We are on your side, O son of Jesse. Peace, peace to you, and peace to our helpers, for your God helps you. So David received them and made them captains of the troop. So again, David is interested in developing other leaders, and made them captains of the troop there. So, but there's a lot of spiritual language that's in here, because David is being discerning, and he's saying, look, if you're going to come and help me, that's great. We'll be united with you. But if you seek to betray us to the enemy, then God's going to bring judgment. So there's that there, and then Amasa talks about, for God helps you. There's a recognition there that David is indeed helped by God, and that's another common phrase that's used in this chapter, is this whole idea of helping. We'll get to that in a minute, but so obviously these men are spiritual men. They recognize the importance of a spiritual walk, and they will be committed to the leadership that is at hand there, that God has established, which is David. Now, just talking about being helpful then, or help, we saw there in that those previous verses that help was mentioned quite a number of times. Now, the word help is, or at least that particular Hebrew term, is used 7 times in this chapter, and I think that's a very, very important characteristic of a leader, of a man of God, a woman of God, is that they're helpful. Because if you're standing on your own, you can't be helpful to anybody. So in order to help, there has to be other people that you're giving a hand to. So you can't be standing on your own. So, but I wanted to look at the verse 22 here, where it says, for at that time they came to David day by day to help him, until it was a great army, like the army of God. And helping people is a very spiritual thing to do, and because affording help is an all-encompassing thing, because we can help people physically, we can help people emotionally, we can help people spiritually, and I think these men came and did that on all those fronts, because David was being chased about at the time. Saul had died, but there was kind of a bit of a political difficulty, as it were, in establishing David as the king, and so that men came and helped him. There needed to be help given for the establishment of David as king, as the legitimate king, because there still was people there that were still of the house of Saul, and still had it in for David, as it were. But the number of people that came to David's aid and to establish him as king was then described as a great army, like the army of God. And so when we help people in the name of the Lord, it then becomes an army of God. It's not just an army of men or an army of women just doing sort of good things. It's indeed the army of God. So, but as we look at this particular word help, it is the Hebrew word ezer, and interestingly enough, there is a man in verse 9 whose name is Ezer, which means helpful. And we're going to look at those lists of men that come from the Gadites. But that's what the Hebrew word looks like there. And if I just get my little pen going here, give me a second to annotate. Just draw here. So the first letter here is this. I'm just kind of circling this in red. Is what's called An, and then there's the second letter there. So as you're going from right to left, An, Zan, and Resh is those particular things. But but let's look at what these letters mean. So An is the first letter, and it is a picture of an eye, which has to do with understanding. The second letter is Zan, so that's where you get your Z sound there, or sorry, Z for those of us in the UK and Ireland. But it was a picture of a mattock, which you use to break up the ground and to be able to plant things. So it's working hard to promote growth. Very, very important letter in the Hebrew language, because it had to do with struggle and sustenance. And for those of you that were at the Bible study when we did Psalm 119, we spent time talking about that, because when there's, in order for there to be spiritual growth, there has to be struggle with the spiritual ground, as it were, because you don't just throw seed on top of hard soil. You know, it has to be broken up so that the seed can then go into the ground and then grow, and then we get fruit. The last letter is Resh, which is a picture of a man's head, but it talks about things of importance. Things that are in charge, or the things that are foremost, whatever. So, but when you string these particular letters together, you get what I have basically come up with here, is that the real help that we can give is when we understand and are prepared to work hard and smart to promote growth amongst ourselves, and to see that we concentrate on that which is important. And I think that's a good way to look at help, and that's how these men helped David. They had an understanding of what to do. Their eyes were open. They didn't just kind of go into it not thinking. They were prepared to work hard, and they were prepared to work smart. And why? It was to promote growth amongst themselves, and to promote the kingdom of David. But really, it was more, really the end product was the kingdom of God, because it's just like up there in verse 22, this was like a great army, like the army of God. And to see that we concentrate on that which is important, because you can end up concentrating on a whole pile of things that aren't really that important, so and I find this in church often these days, that people get caught up in silly details and things that are really, at the end of the day, not really important, but Satan uses those things to go and split people up and cause a lot of dissension and discouragement and so on. And but if we concentrate on that which is important, then that is the real kind of help that is afforded to people. So now, one of the other characteristics of David's men is that they were understanding and discerning. Now, this is a very, very interesting verse here, verse 32. which says the sons of Issachar had understanding of the times and to know what Israel ought to do. Their chiefs were 200, and all their brethren were at their command. Now, when you read through these chapters, these are easy verses just to go and skim over rather quickly. And sometimes we then tend to concentrate maybe on a more prominent tribe like Judah or Benjamin or something like that. These are tribes that are mentioned more often. But when you come across the sons of Issachar, you're going, well, they really didn't amount to much. They all ended up in the north and the northern tribes, and they didn't follow God and all this. But we're not talking about years later. We're talking about in this particular time. And this is a very, very significant verse because it talks about three different things. It says that they understood the times and culture in which they lived, because it says that the sons of Issachar had understanding of the times. And so we as leaders, because we all have influence with people, because leadership is influence. And so if you have any influence with anybody, you're exercising leadership, whether you like it or not. And but the more that we have, and especially in this day and age, and I think the church is kind of being left in the wake here a bit, is that we need to understand the times and the culture, which is moving very, very quickly. Because when we talk to people, and if they don't feel that we're sort of in touch with at least a certain kind of reality in which they're in, it's hard to find common ground. Not that we go into the culture and be part of the culture. There's aspects of the culture today that I wouldn't want to lift on a shovel. But we have to acknowledge that it's there and understand that it's there, and understand in a sense how it operates. And that's important for evangelism. That's important for the gospel. Jesus Christ completely and utterly understood his culture. He communicated in ways that people got. He didn't go in there with some esoteric nonsense that people didn't understand. He spoke about agriculture. He spoke about economics. He spoke about a whole variety of things that people back then understood. Jesus spoke about politics too. So some of his stories had a lot to do with politics. So people got that. So the sons of Issachar, it says they had understanding of the times, but they also understood the timing in which to do things. So because we can understand our culture, we can understand the times in which we live, but if we're going to be moving forward as a church and as a collective body, then we need to get the timing right. And the only way you're going to get the timing right is you hear from God. And but some of these men too were swift as gazelles, and they were spiritual men. They weren't standing around waiting for the cows to come home. They knew when to move. So these men from Issachar were very discerning men, insightful men, men of great understanding. Now, this word understanding too is to me is a very spiritual word because it's used quite a lot in the Old Testament. Can be translated, make me understand, instruct me, give me understanding, different things like this. And but what it has to do with is an individual, if they are in a place that is misty and foggy, they're not going to understand very well the surroundings that they have. And so what they do is they call out to God, who has understanding of all things, and they say, Lord, give me understanding, get me out of the mist, get my head out of the sand here, so that I can see things clearly. And I've shared this story in the past, and my father will remember it when we went to the hike to the top of Mount Greylock. in Massachusetts, which is the highest mountain in Massachusetts on the Appalachian Trail, and the top of it was completely and utterly socked in with fog. And so I remember that we were told that at the top of the mountain was a restaurant and an inn, because you could drive to the top. It wasn't a terribly high mountain, but anyway, the trail did pass up over it. And so our goal was to get to this restaurant and get a bit of lunch after our start of our hike earlier that day. And now when we got near the top, still couldn't see the restaurant at all. But I remember the mist was starting to move quite rapidly. And if you've ever been on the top of the Mourns or in and around that area where there's a lot of mist, that the clouds tend to move very, very quickly. So the end was appearing and then it was disappearing. It was appearing and then disappearing again. And but the closer that we got to it, the clearer the thing was. And so then eventually we got right up to the place. And I remember we were looking for lunch and we got there just before the place opened. And the place was locked, which didn't really excite our souls too much. We were quite hungry, but we found the back door that was open, so we got in and got into the place. But you had to be close to be away from the mist. And so in the same way, the sons of Issachar were people that were close to God, because if they wanted understanding of the times, they had to be close to God. They couldn't be far away from God, otherwise they were just in a big mist. So this word understanding is a very, very important word. And then the third thing is that they had a strategy to implement how things were to be done. Because it says there in that second phrase, to know what Israel ought to do. So these were men that were not only culturally aware and aware of the times and also aware of the timings in which to do things, but they knew what Israel ought to do. So they had a projection. They were looking into the future. They weren't just reacting to the circumstances in which they found themselves and putting out fires and things like this, but they were looking down the road, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, and developing procedures and strategies and looking to God and saying, how do we do these things? How do we keep ourselves right? And how do we glorify God in what we're doing? So, and again, that's what's needed in the church. I find the church in this day and age is somewhat bury our heads in the sand or somewhat reactionary, whereas really what we should be doing is responding to things and developing a structure in which to deal with the times and culture in which we live. So because the likes of a gospel meeting on a Sunday night, is not going, people aren't going to darken the door of a gospel meeting unless you go out and you bring people in. So people have no more notion of God than the man in the moon. They're not going to go and look down at a church and say, oh, I want to go and duck my head in there because I'm looking for God. People aren't looking for God, and so we have to be there and know how to engage with people and develop a strategy that then facilitates that. But we also need strategies for how to help each other. And because he talks about in Ephesians about equipping the saints for ministry, and because it's not just about evangelism, it's about personal growth and corporate growth, so that we're all growing in God and know what it is to trust God. I remember when Oprah Winfrey in America started her secret movement or secret church or whatever it was called, some cultish thing. And she had something like very, very quickly, something like 5 million people that signed up to this thing called The Secret. And a lot of them were people from evangelical settings, and they all got roped into what Oprah Winfrey was talking about, which was a lot of New Age nonsense. And it really kind of creeped me out, and I thought it was very, very sad that so many sort of quote Christian people were being embroiled in this whole movement because it all sounded really, really good, but it was new age, unadulterated garbage. And that's why we as Christians need to be equipped. We need to know what we believe. We need to be, in the scriptures. We need to be helping each other. We need to be, not isolated or thinking that we just know stuff and it's okay and whatever. The world is against us in every way, shape, and form, and the world was against David and against his men, but they got themselves together. They had loyalty and joy. So here in verses here, this is down toward the end of the chapter. It says, all these men of war who could keep ranks came to Hebron with a loyal heart to make David king over all Israel, and all the rest of Israel were of one mind to make David king. And they were there with David 3 days, eating and drinking, for their brethren had prepared for them. Moreover, those who were near to them, some as far as Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali, were bringing food on camel or donkeys and camels, on mules and oxen, provisions of flour and cakes of figs, and cakes of raisins, wine and oil and oxen and sheep abundantly, for there was joy in Israel. What a great scene, that all these people are coming together. They were there for a number of days. They were there with a loyal heart. They were there with one mind, and they were doing some very, very practical things about these provisions. They came from some distances because Issachar, Zebulun, and Naphtali were up in the sort of above Sea of Galilee, up that sort of direction. And so it was some distance when they were coming down to Hebron, which was a little bit south of Jerusalem. So, there was a fair distance on foot, and to get there. But there was order there. There was loyalty there. There was joy there. And so this is what men of leadership need to have. Now, just want to look at chapter 12, verse 9 through 13 about the Gadites here, because there's a list of particular men. There's 11 of them, and just interesting meanings of their names. Well, the first one there was Ezer. If you remember, I talked about Ezer earlier, for verse 9, and his name means helper. And so he was the first of the Gadites that was listed there as one of these men of leadership. And there was his buddy Obadiah, and there was a variety of Obadiahs in the Bible. So this was not the same one as the book of Obadiah, but anyway, and it's the same with Ezer. There were a few Ezers knocking about too. But Obadiah means servant of the Lord, and that's what is needed as a man and woman of leadership, is they're not only helpers, but they need to be servants of the Lord. And the third guy was called Eliab, and that was God is my father. And, when I looked at these names initially, because of my limited understanding of Hebrew, I was able to look at those particular names and I knew what they meant, straight away, by looking at them. So I know that, an Eliab there, El is God, and the I there would be sort of the my, and the AB is the father bit. So Eliab, and but God is my father, and what, again, an important characteristic of a man of God, woman of God, is that God is their father. And then we have Mishmana, some mouthful of a name, but now Mishmana in and of itself actually means either fat or grease, and So you might say, what does that have to do with some characteristic here? Is it a fat guy or whatever? But no, but sometimes what Hebrew does is it takes a product or a thing and looks at it and looks at the a certain kind of characteristic about it. And so fat, when it was put in the bottom of the pan and it was melted down, gave a glistening and shiny sort of bottom to your pot before you threw your vegetables or your meat in. And so basically what that then meant was to shine and to reflect. So and I think that's a very important aspect of a leader, of a man, a woman of God, is to shine forth, to reflect the person of God. And but fat in and of itself, when it is cold, doesn't shine. It has to go through heat, and then when the heat's applied, then you shine. These men were under a lot of pressure. They were in a political situation, a leadership situation that was hard, that was tight. Saul's men were still kicking about, even though Saul himself was dead, and they were causing problems. And but in the midst of difficulty and heat, they shone forth as great leaders. And then there was a man called Jeremiah. In fact, there's two men called Jeremiah in this particular list, and they're different from the Jeremiah of the prophet Jeremiah. So there's a good number of Jeremiahs. So it must have been a fairly popular name among the Jews. And but that word there or that name means the Lord will rise. And it's a great name for what's going to take place. In amongst this whole scenario and this situation that's difficult and hard, guess what? God's gonna rise up, and God is gonna show forth His glory and His honor, and we need to believe that in this day and age, because I think it's easy just to roll over and play dead and go, well, see, here's the politics, and here's the gays, and here's the abortionists, and then here's this and that and the other thing. And it's just all going south. And so we might as well just go and crawl in our house and pull up the bedclothes and go and hide. But, God does not want us to get depressed and do they dive here. Let's get this, this name, as it were, this meaning incorporated into ourselves. The Lord will rise, and that's an exciting thing. You can get out your door with that kind of promise. And know that you're part of that. To be part of God's kingdom is an amazing thing. And then we have Attai, that again is sort of an interesting name, means to be fit or to be timely, and that's a very, very necessary thing within leadership. You can't be a slouch. You can't be a couch potato, so can't be just, slumming around and going to meetings as it suits us, or not go to meetings, or just, get onto YouTube and, watch a sermon or something like this. It's getting out, because when you're out, you're fit. This is the one advantage that I have with the dog that we have, is I have to walk the animal every morning. So I have lost, probably in the neighborhood of about 1.5 stone. Now, for my father's understanding, that's just over 20 pounds in weight. So, which is good for me, because I was getting a little bit heavy on it. And so now the dog has helped me to be fit, but and when you're fit, you feel better. You're more alert. You're more awake, and and when you go to bed at night, you actually sleep better, because you're not just slumming about and just kind of tired, sick and tired about being sick and tired. So, but being fit does take time. It takes discipline, and being timely, being on time for stuff, and cognizant of that. So these leaders were like that. And then there was Eliel, which means God of his God. And so, God was, in and through this name, left, right, and center. So, and what that says to me is that that God was, very, very much incorporated into his being and into his fabric. And there we have in verse 12, Johanan, which is where eventually the name John comes from. Okay. In the New Testament, we obviously have, John the Apostle and John the Baptist and all that kind of thing. Well, anyway, that name, which is a kind of a Greek carryover from the Hebrew of Johanan. Okay. So, so here we have favored of the Lord, and God favors us. God, knows that if things are going to be going forward, God's favor, his grace has to be on us. If we don't have the grace of God and we don't have the mercy of God, we ain't going anywhere. So, so here's a leader that understood that. And then Elzabad, again, you can see the L there, which has to do with God. And so God has bestowed. So, and we need gifts from God. We can't do this on our own. We cannot lead on our own. We need the gifts and calling of God to be upon us. And I think about that verse in Romans chapter 11, I think it's verse 28, something like that. But it says the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, meaning that God cannot call them back. Once God gives a gift, once God gives a calling, he doesn't backpedal on it. He doesn't go, well, maybe got that wrong and we'll withdraw it. Now, the way it could be withdrawn in a sense is if we then squander it or mess it up or, not use it, but God's calling is always going forward, and he'll not call that back. So, so we need the gifts of God upon us. Well, there's Jeremiah again. So, so in verse 10 there was a Jeremiah, and verse 13 there's a Jeremiah. So, so there's an emphasis on this promise that God will rise. And then we have this last bit in verse 13, where we have Macbenai, which meant a knoll or a hill, a little rise, not a huge thing, but enough of a little bit of a hill to get a vantage point. So David wrote in Psalm 61, he says, lead me to a rock that is higher than I. So because sometimes when you're on top of a mountain, you have a big vantage point, but you can't see the detail. And so, God wants us to be just up a little bit so that we can see things just that bit clearer, but still be, in amongst it, as it were. So, so you have, what is it here? The 11 people, because it says that. It says the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and 11th. So, so you have these men from Gad, again, kind of a tribe that not a whole lot is talked about or written about, but what great people, that are part of this thing. Now, just this last screen here, and then we'll sort of tidy it up for the day. David raised up leaders. And so David did not simply lead followers, he led leaders. And this is a big drum that John Maxwell, who writes books on leadership and that kind of thing, I've quoted him quite a lot. Some of this material, even these bits and pieces, I would attribute to him and his writings. But they're very, very good because they're extracted all from scriptures. So but because if you simply just led followers, then when the leader dies, then the followers get dispersed, and then it doesn't go anywhere. But if you lead leaders, then those leaders take over, and they lead other leaders, and it perpetuates, and the kingdom of God grows. So, so we want to ask the question: well, how did David reproduce his leadership in them? And the first thing is that David was relational. So meaning that that David very much got alongside of these men. You see, Saul, he lived in fear, and he was not a relational man. David was a relational man. He was personable. He was approachable. And if you read back in there's a chapter, it's right here, back in 1 Samuel. 22. Yeah. Where it talks about these men that were gathered to David. It says, everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And there were about 400 men with him. You know, this was a collection of people that were eventually became mighty men, the mighty men of David. So, but he accepted basically everybody. Anybody that came, regardless of who and what they were in terms of their background, whether they were in debt, distressed, or discontent, which meant bitter of soul, really brassed off at life and had difficulties and all that kind of, David knew how to deal with those people. And so he was very relational in that sense. David was resourceful. So David made use of the situations and got the best out of it. Even when he was in the wilderness there, he made sure that everybody was resourced properly and enabled and empowered properly. So, and again, it didn't, he took advantage even of the difficult circumstances to train the men, to have faces like lions and to be swift as gazelles on the mountain. What great language. David was rewarding. So he gave, later on, recognition for victory, especially when it came to Joab. Now, I know Joab was a bit of a complicated sort of man, especially in sort of years following, but David looked at Joab, and in terms of how he handled himself, David gave him a job, because he did, did the things correctly, and he was given them position. So, and motivated them with words of encouragement, and really, to me, there's nothing better than being encouraged, and saying, you did a good job. And sometimes that's worth more than money and more than position. And then the last thing here is that David was respectable because of the type of leadership that he was giving his people. Actually, not only did the people gathered to him respect him, but the people that didn't like him, his enemies, actually respected him as well. So, so this was four sorts of things that David used in order to reproduce his leadership. He wasn't like Saul. Saul was insular. Saul was self-serving and was fearful and afraid of other people doing what he didn't want them to do, or whatever. He was just he was and he wasn't a spiritual man. David was a spiritual man. And so that's why this worked. So